All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. So if you are still not seated and would like to not stand the whole time, please go and grab a seat. So first of all, thank you for coming to this month's Tech Tank meetup. We have an amazing presentation for you by Nonso on CSS. We're going to be navigating the newest features in CSS. I know we're programmers, but almost all of us have to program. Most of us are programming for the web, and so being able to understand how to use features in the browser is always welcome. So please be advised, if you can tell, you can see our Neil helping us with the camera work here. We are recording the presentation and we do put it up on YouTube afterwards, so you can rewatch it or a friend can watch it if they don't get to be here. Obviously, if you don't want to be part of that, I guess maybe ask someone else to ask a question for you, but just FYI, the event is being recorded. So I also want to thank our sponsor, Intuit. This is the space that you're in. So this amazing, beautiful office, and Emily, this is the coolest office we've been in, is Intuit's office. They've been really generous with their resources, with their space, with their time. You're also eating their food. So before we call Ian to tell you a bit more about that, just a quick round of applause, because we are all volunteers who are helping organize this, but also unless companies step up in the community, I think a really unique tech thing for companies to sponsor events like this, right? So just want to congratulate them for doing that. But Ian, if you want to come up and say a few words about Intuit.
I thought it was about the pizza.
Hey, I'm Ian. Hey, you either met me via email today or down by the elevators. I think I've now met everybody. Yeah, cool. I think we can go to the next slide. Click it for me. Great, we're hiring. This is a big part of why we want to have folks here. I know Emily, who you probably also met. Hey, if you scan this QR code, we've got a put together list of all the open roles here in Toronto, and we can track you through there so we know if you apply through this event, which is great. And also, just like it was said, it's great to have the community present in this great new office here in Toronto. Intuit's been in this site for just over a year, and we really love being part of the tech community here in Toronto. So enjoy the event, and I'll be around after if you have any questions. Thanks.
They also have a giant stone moose, brass moose.
The materials are questionable.
Questionable material moose that was airlifted onto the balcony here. So if you get to work here, that's an amazing perk. So Tech Tank. So you guys are here as part of the Tech Tank meetup. It is a community of, it's a lively, inclusive tech community where we wholeheartedly embrace tech enthusiasts from all walks of life. The thumbnails you see up there are just the 6 people who help administrate the group. We are all volunteers, no one gets paid, we all have day jobs, but we just really enjoy supporting the community and being part of it. We think the more opportunities we have to all collaborate, the better. So most of you, I hope, came here through Meetup, but this is a QR code to our Meetup group if you somehow didn't come through that page. But if you're not following us on LinkedIn, we do a lot of other events and presentations that are virtual, sometimes not with physical sponsors, and any information about that is on LinkedIn if you want to join us there. This is probably the big one. We have a really active Slack community. And so we post things like job board kind of stuff. We post a event calendar of all the kind of tech related events inside the community. There's a ton of stuff that goes on. It's an amazing community to connect with, so I highly recommend you join that. So just raise your hand if you're a first timer. All right, cool. It's about the normal percentage. Who would consider themselves a new developer or people that are trying to break into the industry? All right, cool. All right, so when we used to be a smaller group, we used to actually let people raise their hand and introduce themselves. I guarantee you there's gonna be 45 minutes of that right now if we did that. But I do want you to raise your hand if you're hiring. We'll go to the other side too. But if you are hiring, you know that Intuit is.
I'll raise both hands.
Yeah. But if anyone else, that way people who are looking for jobs can kind of find them afterwards. Sammy's company back there. Yeah.
My class is hiring Suite 2s, data engineers, and test engineers.
So data engineers, test engineers.
Engineers.
Full stack engineers. Yeah, all sorts of engineers. Yeah?
My company is also hiring full stack engineers, the Rails and React.
Yep, full stack engineers, Rails, and React. Cool. All right. So this is the one looking at a lot of hands. Who's looking for a job? Yeah. All right, well, so you know the people in the community to go talk to, but also like just recognize, when you're in that process, it tends to be really rough, right? So recognize you're not kind of the only one. There's a lot of people in your boat, and really helpful to talk to some other people in the same shoes that can give you tips. All right, so also if you're interested in speaking, all of our talks are sourced from the community. A couple of you have already volunteered and submitted, but you can submit kind of your information on this form and we'll get in contact with you. And sometimes if you're a beginner, we even kind of coach you through the process of helping you write your talk, which has been a really fun. So our speaker last time was someone who was also fairly new. Was it last month? Nice. Interested in hosting. So if you or your company could host an event like this, the way Intuit is, and wants to contribute to the community, grab a link there. We have a page that kind of gives you all the information you need to know about hosting an event, and then get in contact with us. We'd love to work with you. All right. I think there's only one more QR code. So after we finish the presentations today, we want to enjoy ourselves, take some time to socialize, but we also want to be respectful of kind of Intuit's time. So we ask that people start cleaning up and leaving around 8 o'clock. We will announce kind of a bar that we can all meet at afterwards. This tends to be sometimes a challenge because we tend to become a larger group and it's hard to like put a reservation in ahead of time, but we will call around and find a bar that can take a decent sized chunk of us afterwards so we can continue the night if you want to. All right, final slide. So we as a volunteer organization do need some funds to like pay for Zoom and pay for like Google Suite and all that kind of stuff. Not for us. So if you want to just donate, we have a page where you can just sort of contribute money, or if you saw near the entrance, we do this kind of once a year. We just sort of sell a kind of a cool, useful thing. In this case, it's the toque. These are actually really, really good and really warm. I've actually been using it even though I don't really need it to pitch Tech Tank. And they're $20, and so essentially you can use it as a donation and get to support us if you don't already have one. And that's it. So I'm going to invite up Nonso, your speaker, and we'll get started. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. First of all, welcome, and thank you, Intuit, for having us here. Before we start, who likes writing CSS? Just want to show of hands. Sure. Who likes talking about CSS? Who likes reading CSS? Interesting. No, I honestly just want to get like a show of hands and see what the crowd is looking like. So today we are going to be talking about CSS Chronicles, really navigating the newest features in CSS. I've honestly had the pleasure of writing CSS for a while now, and I kind of get frustrated with CSS specifically. There are nights where I'm trying to build out a website and things don't always go as planned. And so last year I had the pleasure of going to a conference and talking to one of the CSS working group members. And they told me that Google actually rewrote their entire engine. And so now we're seeing a lot of new features directly in the browser. And so I'm excited to share that all with you. So before we get into it, CSS, I like to say it's the language that really frustrates most devs. I like to say this because of a few things. There's a lack of organizational support. There's a lack of modern features. We'll talk about this in later slides. And it's really confusing because of some cascade rules itself. And so when we're writing CSS, we have to pay attention to all these things and see that it's actually a really difficult language to go about. And so throughout the years, we've tried to solve solutions, or we've tried to make solutions with things like Sass, CSS modules, and Tailwind CSS. I don't know if you all have been paying attention, but Facebook actually just released one of their newest ones called Style X, which also tries to solve the exact same problems. So we've invented things like supersets, build steps, libraries, in order to solve what really is the primary language for the web itself, when it comes to styling things, that is. So with these three frameworks here, or these three libraries, we've introduced things like mixins, nesting, variables. We've solved the cascade issues, and it makes it easy to reason about for authors. So it looks like we've actually solved everything. So why even bother about the newest features in CSS? Seriously, what gives? The thing is, CSS has evolved. All those features that I mentioned before are now natively supported. You see there's an asterisk there with the all, meaning that things like mixins aren't natively supported yet, but according to the working group, it's actually on its way into CSS itself. But there are a few little hacks that we can do with the newest features that we can actually build in our own types of mixins. If you're familiar with Sass, mixins are the thing that we do to make writing CSS a bit easier for us. So before we get into it, just a bit of today's agenda. We're really going to be talking about the architectural foundations of CSS. This is concerned with how we write CSS today. Then we're going to be diving into responsive design. This is really concerned with how we can build responsive designs and developments. Then we're going to walk through a few notable mentions. These are the little big things in CSS, like I like to call them. So let's get started. CSS custom properties. These are properties that are defined by CSS authors which represent values that can be used throughout a document itself. Things like colors, font stacks, sizes, really any CSS value itself. So what do custom properties even look like? Well, here they are. We can see that we're declaring a custom property here within the root element itself. We start by declaring these double dashed symbols. Then we write the name of the custom property that we want to use. Then we declare the CSS value that we want to assign to that custom property itself. Now you may notice that with custom properties, they're also known as CSS variables. Custom properties, variables, they're used interchangeably, but we really want to be calling these custom properties because they're so much more powerful than what a variable does itself. So in order to actually use our custom property that we've defined, we can see here that within a CSS selector, we're saying that the font family is going to be equal to this var function. This var function actually takes in two arguments. The first one is the variable of the custom property that we've defined. And in the case that the variable itself is not defined, or we forget to include it, we can also include a fallback value. So this specifically is saying, within the font family, go look at our root element, see if any of these variables themselves are defined. Specifically in this case, the font size primary. If it's not defined, then just fall back to the sans serif. Now you may be wondering, what happens if we forget to include the sans serif fallback? Well, CSS is built on the fact that it gracefully fails. Meaning that if the fallback is not defined and the variable itself is not defined, this entire line is skipped and the browser just goes on reading the entire file itself. It doesn't even bother applying these styles. Now, this is great and all, but if you've worked with Sass, you may be wondering, this is just Sass variables. Like, what's new here? The thing is, this is actually where the similarities stop. the similarities between Sass variables and CSS variables, they diverge from this point specifically. Why do we say this? It's because with CSS variables or CSS custom properties, we can actually define them within any single selector we want. In the previous slides, and even in this slide as well, you can see that we're defining them within the root, but we're also defining it within the selector. This means that we can actually overwrite things that we were defined in the root. Custom properties, they also do cascade, meaning that if we have a variable that is defined lower within our style sheet, that is going to take priority. Now, we can actually turn off this cascading rule with variables. And so the other thing that comes with CSS custom properties is this idea of an app property rule. We'll talk about that in a few slides, but with custom properties, they're not just placeholder values. We can pass entire functions directly into these properties. We can define rule sets on these properties. Things like the syntax, whether it inherits, or does it even have a default value itself. So in order to do that, we can define what's known as the app property rule. The app property rule is what lets us define the syntax, whether it inherits, and the initial value. Here you can see that we're defining an app property rule for the color background primary. We're setting the syntax to a color, we're setting the inheritance to false, and we're also setting an initial value for this custom property itself. Meaning that if we forget to define color background primary, once this rule is established, the initial value will take place. And so the browser will know how to properly parse this color background primary if we forget to include it within our style sheet itself. The interesting thing here is that once we define our rule set here, the browser understands what the custom property itself is. By default, if we forget to define the rule, all custom properties are read as strings, meaning that the browser itself doesn't know how to properly parse it, meaning that we can't animate them. But now that we've defined that these are actually colors themselves, specifically the color background primary and the color background secondary, we can actually see here that in this rule, or in this selector here, with the class of .css, we're defining that the color background primary is going to be blue, the color background secondary is going to be red, and then we're setting the background on the normal state to the color background primary. At the bottom here, we're also setting a hover state, so that when we hover over this element that has this class on it, we apply the color background secondary. Now, if we didn't define these rules, once we hover over them, we're automatically going to see a change, and it's going to be very, very snappy. But sometimes we don't want to do that. Sometimes we actually want to transition from one state to the other. So by defining these rule sets here, we can say that these custom properties now have a specific syntax. And because they have a specific syntax, the browser can now interpolate the values between blue and red. So yes, custom properties are now animatable. Because the browser can now interpolate the differences between blue and red, it can smoothly transition from one to the other when you hover over the element and you're using custom properties itself. So you may be wondering about support. How does support play into this? Well, this feature is really cool, but if it's not supported in the browsers, then who really cares about it? Because with support, for custom properties, they've actually been supported for quite a while now. New to this Can I Use website here is this banner up here that says baseline widely available across major browsers. This is something that the Google team actually added a couple of months ago. And so if we see this, it means that across the three major browsers, Firefox, Safari, Chrome, the feature itself is now supported. Now we can also see the custom properties themselves. They go back various versions. Like if we're looking at Chrome, they go back all the way to version 49. And then they start to break down once you get to version 48. This is really cool. So we've been talking about this idea of organization. We've looked at how we can organize our CSS custom properties into reusable variables. But can we actually organize different CSS style rules? This is where CSS nesting comes into play. If you're familiar with Sass, we've been nesting for quite a while now. It's something that people have been really asking for. So nesting itself is now natively supported within CSS. Nesting provides the ability for us to nest one style rule inside another. It reduces the weight of a style sheet, and it reduces the overhead of repeating selectors. But it also centralizes component styles itself. So what does nesting even look like in native CSS? Well, here it is. Here we can see that we have a section selector, and we're nesting two different elements here. We're nesting one element that is a paragraph element, and we're selecting its first of type, but we're also nesting a class selector here. Now, you may be wondering, this looks exactly like we do in Sass, and you wouldn't be entirely wrong. These two elements here are the nested element and also the class selector. And with CSS nesting, although it looks very similar to Sass, it's entirely different because in Sass, we're compiling directly into CSS, whereas with nesting natively within CSS itself, the browser is doing this parsing for us. So this has implications on this little and symbol you see where we have the paragraph first of type, and it also has implications on specificity itself. I've battled specificity for quite a while, and it's honestly one of the most frustrating things within CSS. But once we're using nesting in CSS, it does become easier, but we also do have to be aware that while using nesting, it does play a role in there as well. So on the left here is us nesting within CSS, and on the right is what a similar selector would look like if we were to write it out in full. And when I say we have, it has roles in the specificity challenge itself. At the top here, we could see that we have a specificity here of 0 IDs, 0 classes, and then 2 element selectors here. So if we were nesting an element selector, then if we actually were to use a class selector, our class selector rule would actually overwrite this. And so because we have to pay attention to this, we may want to do something like stick an important on there or use another solution. But if we're using it with classes, here we have one class selector, one element selector. So the only way to really overwrite this is to use something that has a higher specificity, either using an ID selector or even using an important rule there as well. So this and symbol has a lot of, it has a lot of meaning, but it also has caused a lot of troubles. Because when the working group was actually putting nesting directly into CSS, they were like, do we actually include this and symbol? Do we leave it out? Do we write another syntax to say how do we nest paragraphs or element selectors? The thing is, this and symbol, because it's caused a lot of problems, a lot of working group members have wanted to see how we can get rid of it. And so pretty soon, the and selector is going to be deprecated, and then we could just nest this paragraph element selector here, just as we're nesting our class element, or class selector over here. So yes, we can even nest media queries. Because really, with CSS nesting, what is required is a symbol before the actual attribute or rule itself. And the reason that we had the and symbol there was due to this exact fact. We required a symbol. With class selectors, the symbol there is a dot. With the @media, the symbol there is the @sign. With the element selector, the symbol there is the ampersand. And so this comes into play when we're nesting things like media queries, container queries, and other style rules that have the @media. So media queries, you would notice here that the syntax here is actually a bit different than what we're used to. We're used to writing things like min width, max width, min width, and max width to define a range. But now the media queries now support logical properties as well. And so we have the ability to use this greater than symbol, this less than symbol, greater than or equal to, or even define a range using these symbols, and we no longer have to go with the min-max or the min width or the max width there. So how is support for nesting itself? Nesting is actually pretty well supported across the browsers, but support for it is still growing. If you were to compare it to something like variables that we saw in the past, you can see here that the actual versions required for CSS nesting are a lot later. The most stable version of nesting in the browser is Chrome 120. And with Edge, there are some flags there that we have to turn on in order for nesting to work there as well. Safari, the same thing. The latest version of Safari supports nesting. The latest version of Chrome, Firefox also supports nesting as well. So we've talked about this idea of organization, organizing our style rules, organizing our CSS custom properties into variables, organizing our style rules as well. But one problem and fight still exists: the cascade. As authors, we are not the only ones that are defining style rules for the browser. We have browser vendors that are writing style sheets. We have library authors that are writing style sheets. Even ourselves, we may be working on multiple projects, and we may be sharing styles within those projects themselves. So this leads to a really large specificity battle. We've come up with solutions like the @important rule, the BEM naming convention, object-oriented CSS. And while these rules work, they're not scalable. So this is where cascade layers comes into play. Cascade layers allow us to balance the styling concerns within the same origin. They allow authors to create specificity-based layers to organize styles themselves. So we can create layers and then plop our CSS style rules directly within the layers. And the last layer that we create is going to have the highest specificity itself. So in order to define a layer itself, we have this new keyword, the @layer rule. With @layer, we can give it a name and then plop in any of the CSS style rules that we want to be included in that layer itself. By the way, the name is actually also optional. If we do not include a name, then it's what's known as an anonymous layer. And this layer is going to be the highest specificity throughout before we get to any unlayered styles itself. So you can see here that we can now place our style rules directly inside the layer that we've created. So here would be an example of us using layers in our code base. We could do something like create a resets layer, a general layer, and then also create a anonymous layer down here. So you may have run into problems where you want to either create multiple layers and you're wondering, oh, do I have to always have those layers defined? The thing is, you can actually, at the very top here, define the names of all your layers. And then within the project, you can use those layers. What happens is that once you define it at the top and you use them in the project again, they're actually merged. So resets defined here is going to be merged with the order that it's defined within the very top there. So even if we were to place @layer resets with the selector below the component layer, resets would still be the first layer within this stack. The other cool thing here is that we can actually use CSS imports and import something like Bootstrap directly into our style sheet. And then we can include Bootstrap within its own layer, meaning that if now Bootstrap is within its own layer, we can have our component layer be on top of Bootstrap. So there's no more finagling around with trying to overwrite Bootstrap styles. We could just stick Bootstrap in the lowest layer possible, and then any of the styles that we write are going to overwrite the style sheets that Bootstrap has given us. So this is just saying that with Bootstrap, if we're using layers, we can stick Bootstrap at the lowest layer and our component styles at the most top layer. Since it has a higher specificity, it is going to overwrite the Bootstrap styles itself. So how is support for cascade layers itself? They're actually really widely supported. The CSS working group themselves, they've spent some time making sure that these features are available in our modern browsers. But how about all the other browsers, the older versions of those browsers themselves? And so that's where support is really still growing. So if you're building applications that are really targeted towards those older browsers, then maybe Cascade Layers is not the right time to switch over to it. But if your audience and your user base is mainly on the newer versions of these, then maybe all these features are going to benefit you. There is so much more within this category itself. But as the web itself has evolved to become this responsive platform, we too must really move into the responsive design and development world itself. So previously we talked about the updates to media queries and how they support logical properties with the range syntax. Before, this is how we would write them, and then after, we can write them like this now. But media queries themselves, they are problematic in today's world. Because we use media queries to really query for the size of the viewport. But the thing is, we aren't building for the viewport anymore. With things like React, Vue, Angular, Astro, Svelte, we're really building components. So it makes sense that we now begin to query for the size of a container itself. Previously, we were at this we were at the state where we were building macro layouts or layouts concerned with the overall size of the page. But now with these new frameworks, the term of micro layouts has now become a thing. Micro layouts really are concerned with the layout of a component itself. And so enter container size queries. They iterate on the idea of micro layouts. They allow us to modify DOM styles based on the size of the container that is defined. So what do container queries even look like? Here is what one is like. We're defining a container up here. We're saying that the container has a specific name, and then we're also giving the container a type. Here we're saying the container has a type of inline size. This means that it's only going to be looking at the width of the container and not considering the height. Down here, we're actually using a container. You'll notice one thing. A container query looks exactly like a media query. It looks very, very similar. So with a container query, we use the @container rule. We can give it the name or specify the name of the container we want to query. We can say that we are querying for the size of the container where the width is larger than 500 pixels. And once we do that, we can apply those style rules there. And since they're very similar to writing media queries, we can actually take that @media rule that we've written, switch it to an @container rule, define what our container is, and then we've automatically converted our code base from media queries now into using container size queries themselves. With container queries, we actually do get some container query units. We get the CQW, which is going to be querying the size of the container width, the CQH, which queries the height, the CQI and CQB. These are the logical properties. So the inline size or the block direction. In an English language, the inline would be the width, and the block would be the height. We also do get CQmin and CQmax, which is going to be picking between the smaller of the two or the larger of the two, depending on if you're using the CQmin or CQmax. Container size queries are actually pretty well supported within the browser, but support for them is still growing. They actually landed officially just last year, and so the working group is working on making sure that they're supported in older browsers as well. The thing with container size queries is that we don't only get the ability to query the size of the container, we can also query the style of a container itself. So we can define our container here, and the container itself is actually optional. And this is saying that we're going to be using a style query. So with those custom properties that we were talking about earlier, if we say that this foo variable exists on the container, then we're going to be applying these styles. Earlier I said mixins themselves are actually not supported natively within CSS. And so with container style queries, you can get something very similar. You can say that on this parent container, we're going to be defining this foo variable, define all the styles that you want to be included there, and then make sure that if the foo variable exists inside the selector, we're going to be applying these styles there. The awesome thing about container queries, or container style queries rather, is that we can actually also define a style that says, does my parent container itself have a display of flex? If it has a display of flex, then apply these following style rules. This begins to unlock the power of star queries, and we can ask a lot of questions. So with support for container style queries themselves, they are still growing. The shaded green that you're seeing here is under a flag. And so they are in Chrome Edge, not Safari, unfortunately, or Firefox, but under Chrome and Edge, they're under a flag. And so we would have to turn these on before we use them. So they're not quite ready for production, but they are coming, and I'm really, really excited for them. The new era of responsive components looks really, really cool. So time for some fast-paced notable mentions. Logical properties themselves are now fully supported within the browser itself. So things like inline size, things like the inline direction or the block direction, start or end. We no longer have to say that we're going to be at the left or the right side. We can say if we're at the start, if we're in a rightward-facing language, that will automatically switch to a right-to-left reading language there. We do have new pseudo-selectors that exist. We have the has selector, the where selector, the is selector. This makes writing CSS itself a whole lot easier. We have some new color functions, meaning that we're no longer sticking to the sRGB color space. With these new displays that are coming out, we now have the ability to specify colors within the P3 gamuts or even wider gamuts as well. We can even easily mix colors themselves with the new color mix function. So we can say that we're going to be mixing color from the sRGB space with a color from the P3 space, and the browser will take care of that for you with this new color mix function. There is so much more that I can talk about, but alas, not going to. It has been a really wonderful year for CSS itself. And there are a lot of new features that I'm really excited that we get to try out in our modern browsers today. We couldn't cover everything. So if you want to check out a full list, the Google Chrome team has actually written a really comprehensive blog over at their blog platform there. It's called CSS Wrapped, and I implore you to go check it out. It's an awesome read. So I want to go back to this term, CSS. It's the language that used to frustrate most devs. Thank you. Did anyone have any questions? Yep.
So when we're doing Bootstrap, when we're like having Bootstrap and we're trying to change the styles of Bootstrap, sometimes Bootstrap just adds its own ID or its own class on it, and we are like unable to change that styling. So will layering solve the issue with that?
Yeah, layers would solve that particular issue. We could stick Bootstrap in its own layer, make sure that it's at the lowest layer, and then any styles that we apply on top of our layers that we've created is going to overwrite all the styles that Bootstrap has done.
And has is basically just a replacement of specificity. Like if you see that we're using the pseudo class has, and we're just writing, say, the paragraph might be like deep inside, but when I use has, I'm just not going that specific.
So the has selector itself, it does have specificity issues with it. When we're using has, we do have to take into account those specificity things. I do have a blog post on my website talking about has, and it goes into depth, explaining those specificity battles that I'm talking about. And so I can share the link with you after.
So with the at property rule, that basically means that CSS is now like, you can make it weakly typed, right? When you say that like this custom property is a color or a size or something. What is the tooling like around that? Like in VS Code, if I if I type this property to be a size, is it going to give me like the red squiggles if I put in a color or something? Or is it going to like autocomplete if I'm, like, is that tooling environment there?
So unfortunately, that tooling environment is not there, and so we will, like, if we do specify a syntax for our custom property and we use the incorrect syntax, we'll see that error in the browser, but unfortunately not in our development environments. I know it is disappointing, it is sad, but
So it defeats the purpose.
well, it allows us to interpolate our values, and so we no longer read the custom properties just as strings. We can give them like we can assign them a number type, or a color type, or an angle type, and so the browser itself will now know that this is specifically that type, and so if we're doing anything like animations, the browser knows how to properly handle that.
When we were discussing about SAS and CSS, right? So it looks the same, but one is precompiled, like you said, it is cascading in precompiled. When it comes to actual efficiency, which one is better? Because it looks the same, but on the browser end it's different.
Which, like, in terms of, sorry, can you, I didn't quite understand that.
Yeah, like the cascading and precompiled, right? So when it comes to browser, so one is cascading and one is precompiled. So which one is more efficient when the processing we calculate in terms of browser?
I'm actually not sure, but I'm really interested to find out in terms of, like, if there is a difference between, or if there is an actual difference in efficiency between the two. Yeah, I'm really curious to find that out. So if I do, I'll likely share it with you. Hey.
I guess my question is a little towards the syntax. When you were talking about the media queries, so there was a part inside the parentheses where you were declaring min width greater than 500. So is that a condition for it to apply the styling only to media queries that have a minimum width of over 500 pixels? Or is it also like a parameter that is receiving that by default it's setting the min width of all the styles that are going to, of all the queries that are going to be receiving the style to 500?
So it is a condition, and so if the viewport itself reaches that 500 pixel size, then all the styles that are within that media query are going to be applied. And so, yeah, it is the condition there.
So I guess if we were to like, again, dynamically like change the minimum width, we'd have to set it in line.
Yeah. Any more questions?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to ask about the nesting component. Was it, I mean, more of an example just to show, I guess, like the organizational power of, I mean, these new CSS frameworks? Because I'm just kind of wondering, is there like a tangible difference in, setting the styles within, say, the section versus, the traditional way of, the specific, say, ID selectors outside of that section?
Yeah, with nesting, it is basically for organizational purposes. It allows us to really, like, now that we've moved over to component level design, it allows us to incorporate all those style rules that are affecting that specific component directly within one selector. With nesting, we can accomplish that. With other solutions, it makes it just a bit harder to read through the code base. Any more questions? Hey.
So my team's starting a new project right now, and for that, we're considering using fluent CSS. So with all these new features, would that influence your decision around that, or would there be anything to keep in mind going forward?
So the thing with Tailwind CSS is that they have to write additional libraries in order to support these features. I know Tailwind just recently launched their container query library. So now container queries, you can use container queries within Tailwind, but choosing to write native native CSS itself. Once it's fully shipped in the browser, your teams can now begin to use them.
You mentioned different gamuts, and you know how there's CSS for how, like a media query for printing stuff is like CMYK. Can I tell the browser that I want to print this in specific CMYK colors and stuff?
Yeah, you can.
Oh, cool. That's awesome.
Just adding to his question, you could use the at print probably and set the colors in the variables and change within the at print the colors to the OK LCH or other color format.
Oh wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
You can start printing magazines.
Any more questions? Hi.
I want to confirm about the file size when you compare CSS and SAS. The file version of SAS version, the file size lesser compared to CSS with the using about 15 copies.
I'm honestly not sure about the file size specifically. I have to look into that for you.
Can you repeat the question, please?
They were wondering about the file sizes between SAS and native CSS. Is one, like now that all these features are natively supported, and we no longer have to like compile our SAS files into CSS, is there going to be a size difference there? And so I'm honestly not sure. Maybe there would be because we're no longer having to worry about what SAS is going to be outputting out to our CSS files. So we're sure of the selectors that we're going to be writing, and so you may see a smaller file size, but it may not be noticeable, but have to definitely do more research there. Any more questions? Awesome, well, thank you so much.